As far back as the year 2750 BC, John Fish invented electricity. It's an invention that would, eventually, reshape how human life would ultimately be observed. And we can all thank John Fish for this invention, because without it, you wouldn't be able to see this video right now. In the year 2020, John Warp invented Charge. This is an invention that would forever change how life in the city is viewed. Also, it's how I power my toaster now. Okay, so the first thing we need to know is how Charge works. It has a maximum count of 20 and decays by 1 at the end of every turn. That's it. Well, to be fair, the potency will never decrease, though only certain IDs can even gain it to begin with. That's literally the entirety of how the status effect works, but it serves as a currency that can give certain skills additional effects, like inflicting more debuffs or a bunch of coin power. Any IDs that can gain charge potency do so by spending their charge count in multiples of 10 over the course of a fight, effectively making them stronger as the fight progresses. There are, however, a good amount of effects that interact specifically with charge. The first is Charge Barrier, which gives you shield equal to your charge barrier multiplied by 3, or if it's a W Corp ID, multiplied by 5. At the end of the turn, it gets converted into charge count and you then lose the shield. While it's not too universally useful, it is just more charge, and most charge IDs tend to be on the frailer side, so any shield helps them by a little bit. Load is a status that only Otis can apply at the time of recording, either through her W Corp ID or her Dimension Shredder E.G.O, though that only applies to herself. Load has a maximum value of 6 and increases the damage that skills that spend charge count deal by 2.5%, or 5% if the unit is from W Corp per stack. Skills that spend charge tend to do high damage already, so this makes your nuke skills hit even harder while also boosting some of the lower damage charge spending skills. Photoelectricity and Spark Discharge can only be inflicted by Multicrack, Office Heathcliff, and Gregor's AEDD respectively. Both give a unit charge if they hit an enemy who has the debuff, with Photoelectricity giving charge equal to its value up to 3, plus an additional 3 if the attacker has 5 or less charge. While Spark Discharge gives the attacker 1 charge count before being reduced by 1, not unlike Rupture and Sinking count. It also makes all Gloom skills inflict 1 Rupture count, and while Rupture is frequently tacked onto Charge IDs, it's not really their focus, with one major exception. Lastly, we have a case of unique charge, thanks to the addition of Red Eyes and Penitence Ryoshu being introduced with the 4th Walpurgisnacht. Red Eyes and Penitence, the statuses, not the ID, will grant you additional bonuses like inflicting more bleed potency and granting shield and SP recovery, then can be spent to modulate her skills for group HP and SP healing using her skill 3. In essence, they are both just charge, they just have some effects tacked on. When it comes to Sin affinities, the most common among charge teams are Gloom, Pride, Envy, and a bit of Lust. When it comes to Sin affinities that they want, the majority of E.G.O and passives rely on Gloom, Pride, Envy, and Wrath.
Miss!
There's also the Pride Dimension Shredders, which need Gluttony and Sloth for some reason, but you're not likely to need either of those for reasons we'll get into shortly. Charge E.G.O tend to fall into the category of being used to generate charge, with only a few actually spending it for effects. Additionally, most of these E.G.O give the most charge to the user rather than their allies. The thing is, this makes any E.G.O capable of giving charge to allies way more valuable real estate for a team built around charge. Among these, there are 2 E.G.O that stand out among the rest, the more prominent of the 2 being Electric Screaming Merceau. Electric Screaming itself doesn't deal a great deal of damage. It has a weight of 2 and definitely has the most benefit in a team focused around activating Envy Resonance. The thing is, charge teams are actually quite good at triggering Envy Resonance as long as you don't have only the nuke skills, and every charge Merceau has an Envy skill 1, which is really reliable. The big benefit here is not only that Merceau gives 12 charge count to himself, but also guarantees that whoever has the least charge gets 8 charge count themselves. The amount of other allies that are affected increases with your envy resonance, so I wouldn't say it's reliable to hit more than half of your team at once with this bonus, but it's still a great natural boon. They even throw in some offense and defense level up if you manage to get 4+ resonance after using it. This E.G.O is fairly cheap, so the corrosion isn't out of the question. This particular corrosion gains attack weight with envy resonance and also spends a large amount of charge count to vastly increase its damage. In a dedicated charge team, this is more of a niche maneuver you can pull if you manage to get full envy resonance in order to deal decent AoE damage, rather than something you rely on frequently. The second in this category is Don Quixote's Telepole, which gives herself anywhere from 10 to 30 charge count in a single use provided it hits, while also giving additional charge count to all allies equal to your envy resonance. She also gives small amounts of charge count to a random ally every turn based on your envy resonance with this E.G.O's passive. The corrosion this time around gives herself the same amount of charge count as the awakening, and then gives all of her allies 12 charge count, which is an insane amount for an overclock that only costs 8 resources total. The trade-off is that everyone on your team also gains 5 fragile and 10 rupture this turn. The fragile is less dangerous since it's current turn, but the rupture will remain, meaning the next hit everybody takes deals 10 more damage to them. With how cheap the E.G.O is, it might genuinely be worth the trade-off for that huge amount of charge gain. One other charge E.G.O that isn't talked about a lot is Faust's Telepole, mostly because it competes for a slot with Fluid Sac. Faust's Telepole can give her anywhere from 7 to 10 charge, depending on the result of the coin, on top of inflicting Paralyze and giving allies both Envy power-up and Haste next turn, but the real benefit actually comes from the passive. Gaining 2% damage per charge count is a very solid bonus for any Charge ID, since it is basically a free damage increase. On top of that, any skill that spends a set amount of charge will cost 2 less for the remainder of the fight. This can be counterproductive under certain circumstances, but overall is a great option in any case. The corrosion this time is not nearly as useful, giving slightly more charge and inflicting more paralyze, but inflicting some paralyze and bind to 2 random units on landing tails, which means it can debuff your allies if you're not lucky enough. It's just not worth the additional resource and SP cost, unfortunately. I know that people are going to question why I'm vouching for Telepole, but I guarantee you that if you use this E.G.O, you'll understand why Fluid Sac is an unnecessary crutch for a lot of teams. In terms of other E.G.O that give charge to the user, there are a lot of options. Heathcliff's AEDD can give anywhere from 0 to 7 charge based on how low his HP is at the time of use, as well as 2 haste the next turn. Honglu's Dimension Shredder not only gives him 5 charge, but also 2 haste for the next turn. It also gives him 1 charge every time he's hit, and can revive him once by consuming all of his charge count. Yisang's Dimension Shredder gives him 4 charge for every turn that he goes without being damaged. Ryoshu's Blind Obsession gives anywhere from 2 to 12 charge, depending on how many enemies are hit and how many of those hits are critical. Gregor's AEDD gives himself 10 charge, and inflicts 15 Spark Discharge, ultimately leading to 15 charge count across your team over the next several hits. While it isn't a good E.G.O right now, as soon as Gregor earns himself a decent Charge ID that isn't Rose Spanner, it should become a pretty common option for investing a lot of charge count into your allies in a charge team. And lastly, Ishmael's Blind Obsession, on top of being a massive SP boost for the team, can give her anywhere from 6 to 42 charge count, depending on how many enemies are hit. Heathcliff's Holiday also generates charge, I guess. I wouldn't use it in this team just for that, though. When it comes to payoff E.G.O for charge, there are 3 that immediately come to mind. The first is Don Quixote's Electric Screaming, which has the same use case as Merceau's. Use it when you can hit a high envy resonance to hit as many enemies as possible, and it spends charge to amplify its damage even further. The occasional attack power-up from the passive is also pretty helpful occasionally. However, this is another E.G.O that is pretty cheap to overclock. If you do, not only does it just inherently deal more damage, but it guarantees that you reach 20 charge before spending any at the cost of some percentage of your HP, letting it effectively deal double damage no matter what, but spending 20 charge count in the process. The second is Otis's Dimension Shredder, which, while gaining improved attack weight under any resonance, is a pretty strong AoE E.G.O even by default. A low charge count, it will consume your HP to give you 10 charge count, though it always takes a flat 10% of your HP, unlike Electric Screaming's 1% per charge count missing. It then consumes all of your charge to boost your damage by 1% for every charge consumed. This E.G.O hits really hard while also giving some haste and load to Otis equal to her charge potency up to 3. The passive also increases her max charge count to 25, while increasing the damage of her skills that consume charge count based on her charge potency. The corrosion, like Electric Screaming, consumes HP so that you max out your charge count, then spends it all for a damage bonus that is twice as potent as that of the Awakening. However, nothing else in the skill makes the 6 additional resources needed worth it, so I would advise against using the Overclock. The last payoff E.G.O for charge is Heathcliff's Telepole, which gains charge equal to your Envy Resonance before spending charge in increments of 5 to give you up to 12 skill power. This E.G.O rolls insanely high even on Awakening, and even gives up to 15 charge count back if you hit Tails. The passive also gives you a small amount of charge count based on your Envy Resonance when you get a kill. The corrosion is the same, except it always gives 15 skill power and gives you fragile if you land heads. It is the highest naturally rolling skill in the game at 54, though it is not always practical to overclock into this skill. It is still hilarious to see a high number though. Other E.G.O that charge teams fuel easily include Faust's Hexnail, which only requires Envy, and makes the various Envy nukes found on Charge IDs much more powerful. Fluid Sac. Red Eyes Open is a reliable AoE skill that also gives a small amount of healing, and allows Ryoshu to pretty consistently gain 1 attack power-up after it's used. Contempt Awe helps you gain more E.G.O resources and is pretty hard to trigger Contempt of the Gaze with in this particular team setup, though it won't ever reach its full potential in a charge team. Chains of Others is a nice support tool that only requires 1 Sloth, which Dawn will be able to generate easily. Heathcliff's Fell Bullet is pretty easy to field, but doesn't have much of a practical use here. If you have this and not AEDD, then it's a decent substitute in the meantime. Heathcliff's Binds is a very powerful E.G.O that this team can field pretty consistently. If you don't have what you need for Blind Obsession, this is your best secondary option for the highest possible free damage. Ishmael's Roseate Desire inflicts a ton of bind, offense level down, and paralyze for the current turn. And if you would rather use Otis's Holiday as opposed to Dimension Shredder, this team can feel it pretty well, so it's a decent option for any SP recovery you might need. There are a lot of good charge IDs that we need to go over here, due to them all being very modular. So for the sake of brevity, I'm going to briefly go over the charge IDs that I don't think fit well into a team specifically dedicated to charge as of this video. Rose-Spanner Rodion and Rose-Spanner Merceau, while being charge IDs, focus a lot more heavily on Tremor, with Merceau not even being able to gain charge except to burst Tremor with his skill 3. That being said, their Sin affinities are actually very strong for charge, and using Rose-Spanner Rodion as a sub for an ID that you may be missing is actually not a terrible idea in any case. Her own Hexnail or Pursuance are great healing E.G.O should you be missing another option for HP recovery. She just won't be providing much in the way of charge support is all. Rose-Spanner Gregor and W Corp Yisang are both very good IDs in Rupture teams. While Gregor lacks good support for charge outside of AEDD, Yisang is like Rose-Spanner Rodion in that he's a good substitute if you happen to be missing a good charge ID from another Sinner to build your team. Overall, though, his massive amount of Rupture infliction is not going to shine perfectly unless you're building around Rupture, something that charge IDs just aren't capable of right now. Lastly, Rabbit Heathcliff is a charge ID, I guess, and good in any team, though his actual charge abilities are a bit of an afterthought for what he's being used for. Now, moving on to our actual team members for a charge team. Unlike their status effects, the core for charge is not as simple as you would think. Almost every ID is viable in some way, even if that way is due to a specific niche. Additionally, the majority of charge ID skill 1s function exactly the same. They are relatively weak skills which almost exclusively give a small amount of charge, and sometimes gaining a small amount of power or damage with enough charge. As a result, going into detail with every single one would be very redundant, to the point where I'd be saying the same thing roughly 10 times in a row, so I'll only go over the skill 1 if it provides a unique benefit outside from that. There will be a note next to each ID that displays how much charge count from their skill 1, so that you still know how much they gain. So now, let's start establishing our core. First up is probably the most important team member for charge, and that's W Corp Line 3 Cleanup Captain Otis. She's one of the 3 IDs that can currently gain charge potency, and as a result has a lot of skills that consume charge count. The real purpose of her being in the team is that she's the best singular ID for giving other allies charge count in the form of providing Charge Barrier. Charged Leap does this by giving 2 other allies between 3 and 8 Charge Barrier, provided that it activates its coin power conditional. Remember that while the shield you gain from Charge Barrier is small, it basically serves as next turn charge count. This skill also inflicts a lot of bind, which helps any team to an extent. The other thing that Otis does is giving allies load using her skill 3. Rip Dimension is not necessarily the greatest of the charge skill 3s, costing 15 charge count for its coin power conditional until you already have 2 charge potency, which you get through 1 use of this skill, 2 uses of her skill 2, or 1 use of Dimension Shredder regardless of charge count. The damage bonus of load is fairly small, but 30% more damage for a skill like Rip Space, DDER, or Energy Current is going to lead to a significant increase in damage due to their high number of coins. Keep in mind that it will also boost the damage of Rip Dimension should you spend charge count on its use. Her support doesn't end at load and charge barrier though. Her passive will grant 1 clash power up to 5 allies based on her own charge potency, and it does it in reverse deployment order. As a result, this means that W Corp IDs are better to place in the back of the deployment order so that they gain that clash power if they need to. Also, since it includes herself, you don't need to worry about putting her at the front of the party, even though that isn't that bad of an idea. Lastly, because Otis's good skills both consume charge, the passive of Dimension Shredder increasing her damage by up to 10% is going to be very helpful for longer fights like the ones in Railway 4. Now, let's talk about 2 IDs at once since both can fit in the same role for the most part. W Corp Don Quixote and W Corp Ryoshu both serve similar roles to each other. They are the primary damage dealers for the Charge archetype. At least they were, more on that in a bit. Their skill 2s mirror each other quite a bit. Both gain coin power based on how much charge count the user has, and both are called Leap. Don Quixote's Leap inflicts 2 Fragile with its 3rd coin and can gain her 8 charge count, and while she has middling speed, it's still very useful for upping the damage for the rest of your team, should they be slower than her. Compare that to Ryoshu's Leap. It inflicts slash fragility on the 1st coin, meaning she can take advantage of it with the attack itself, but it being slash fragility means it's less universally helpful, and you gain 1 less charge count when compared to Don's. That being said, it is far more powerful when fully ramped up, having a max roll that is 4 higher than Don's and dealing far more damage. Both of them have evades that are pretty good, though Ryoshu's can become better since it gains power based on her charge count, though Lust is slightly less useful in a charge team setup than Gloom is. And lastly, their skill 3 is an Envy Nuke skill that gains insane amounts of power by spending charge count, but will eat your HP if you use it too early. Don's is the more simple of the 2, being one of only 3 base skills in the entire game that can roll 5 coins, and having a coin power of 6 if you spend 10 charge, maxing out the roll at 31 for a flat damage value of 95 total. Ryoshu's is a bit more complicated. It technically needs 15 charge count to gain its 5 power, though using the skill at 7 to 14 charge will substitute the rest of the cost for a large chunk of her HP. For every heads hit she lands, the final coin deals 10% more damage, and getting a kill with that last coin effectively refunds 7 of the charge spent while also giving 7 charge barrier to an ally. Even after the damage boost, this skill's damage caps out at 91, which means Rip Space hits harder while being slightly less consistent. Both skills are 2 of the highest damaging skills in the game though, and 4 points of damage difference isn't going to make either one less useful than the other. The only thing that one really beats the other with is that Don Quixote has far better E.G.O for charge than Ryoshu does. Electric Screaming and Telepole both provide a level of utility that Blind Obsession just doesn't have, even if Ryoshu's ID is probably better as long as we discount E.G.O that they have available. Of course, I would be remiss to not mention that W Corp Ryoshu has a strong alternative in Red Eyes and Penitence Ryoshu. Her kit is actually incredibly simple, so going over each of her skills one by one isn't that necessary. The important parts lie on her unique charge, giving her added bonuses. The most important part of her kit is her Serious Skullbuster, which when used is basically just a miniature version of Fluid Sac for your team. Then, the next turn, whenever you would gain charge, she gives a small healing to herself and an ally instead, depending on which type of charge she would have gained. On top of that, her average roll range is about the same as the percentage score for Madam Web on Metacritic, so it's not like her damage and roll power is lacking either. She also is a lot harder to obtain, being restricted to Walpurgisnacht, while W Corp Ryoshu is a Season 0 identity that's always available, which is why I'd say she isn't a guaranteed add to the team. She's a tankier, more supportive alternative to Double Ryoshu, who still has really good damage, but she fills an important niche to be touched on later. Looking for more damage? Well, next up is Multicrack Faust, the ID that dethroned W Corp Don Quixote and W Corp Ryoshu for their damage, and the only Faust ID who would ever even dream of using Telepole over Fluid Sac, if you're a coward, that is, and it's easy to see why. The Multicrack IDs are the other faction who utilize charge potency, and they spend a lot of charge count as a result. And so I actually have to talk about skill 1, because they are the only charge skill ones that spend charge count. Aside from that, gaining a small amount of charge count on hit is not that big of a contributor. She gets less charge on her skill 1 than any of the other IDs mentioned so far, and that will be the case for the rest of the video as well. The Multicracks gain their charge from their skill 3, which seems counterproductive until you realize that you can just give them charge count using your E.G.O in order to make up for it. That said, gaining between 12 and 16 charge count from a single skill that can also gain up to 4 coin power with enough charge potency is both hilarious and very strong. Plus, the skill inflicts Envy Fragility, a surprise tool that will help us later. Faust specifically finds the most strength in her skill 2. Spending HP in order to make up for the missing charge count for the conditionals really makes it easy to actually spend charge using the skill, and activating the Resonance conditional on the final coin makes the skill deal damage that is comparable to Rip Space. Other good things, okay. She perfectly fuels Fluid. Yet another choice for a damage-dealing charge ID is Reindeer Ishmael, who also is meant to use her skill 1 frequently. It rolls higher than any other skill 1 in the game without boosts, which by itself is pretty good, but it generates a lot of charge, and since Gloom skills are relatively common in charge, you can activate one attack power-up from her passive relatively frequently. That said, while her skill 2 generates a good amount of charge, it doesn't really hit very hard and is more intended as a way to increase sinking count, something that this team really doesn't care about. Mind Whip is yet another Rip Space alternative that gives you a 50-50 chance to attack a random ally or enemy if you don't have the required amount of charge. That said, 8 charge count on this ID is very easy to get, and thus it isn't going to be risky very often. This Ishmael's only real downside is not being a W Corp ID, meaning she only gets half the benefit from load, but that in itself should never be a disqualifier. Another added benefit to bringing Ishmael is having access to Blind Obsession. Group SP recovery is always a really good thing, as is an E.G.O that can hit 7 targets. While Ishmael isn't likely to be going first, the 2 damage up is going to help quite a lot on turns where you also want to use your nuking skills, like Rip Space and DDEDR, and she just happens to have a better speed range than both W Corp Don Quixote and W Corp Ryoshu. Now we're finally to the more supportive IDs that you'd want to bring in the team core. First off, Multicrack Heathcliff. His skill 1 is basically the same as Multicrack Faust, so I won't go over it again, other than to say that it being a Wrath skill does a lot to fuel your charge E.G.O that require Wrath. Once again, you're intended to get charge count from his skill 3, but now we have the added bonus of being able to inflict photoelectricity, which the primary thing he brings to a team. Combined with his high speed, you're fairly likely to be able to allow the majority of your other team members to take advantage of this status to accelerate their charge gain. His skill 2 also mirrors Faust in that it substitutes HP in order to be able to trigger the conditional to gain 2 coin power. However, instead of dealing absurd damage with the last coin, he inflicts enough defense level down to essentially mimic 1 Fragile, and also inflicts photoelectricity. It's a skill intended to allow your other charge IDs to take full advantage of attacking the same target, and it does a pretty good job while also giving his own skill 2 coin power. Now this ID is not going to use Telepole very frequently, not that he needs to. However, since he has a skill that consumes his own HP, he makes pretty good use of AEDD instead. It's a really solid E.G.O, and the good amount of Gloom skills in the team means that the Gloom fragility is going to be pretty helpful in a lot of situations. Lastly, we really want to have either W Corp Merceau or Rhino Merceau, both of whom are mostly included so that you have access to Electric Screaming for group charge gain. Now that doesn't mean that the IDs are bad in any sense. W Corp Merceau does need to be at uptie 4 in order to be not absolute garbage, but don't worry about him. First off, while Rhino is traditionally seen as the better ID, his issue lies in the fact that the only thing charge count does for him is inflicting bleed count. completely unnecessary in this particular team setup. Getting coin power on skill 3 is also nice, and the free aggro and speed from his passive is also pretty good, but that's all he's getting from charge, and he really can't take any advantage from load. As a result, I recommend W Corp Merceau for this slot if you happen to have both. While he does struggle a bit with getting charge count, one use of Electric Screaming makes his skill 3 have full power the whole way through him using it. Energy Current inflicts about 2 Fragiles worth of defense level down, and 30% more damage for it is actually very significant when you have load. His high speed means that you're pretty likely to be able to take advantage of that defense level down with the rest of your party as well. Not convinced by his defense level down infliction? Well, it just so happens that Energy Cycle can also inflict Slash Fragility. A lot of good Charge IDs have their best skill as a slash skills, including Rip Space, DDEDR, Rip Dimension, and a couple other powerful skills also in the team. It being a Gloom skill contributes to both Reindeer Ishmael and W Corp Dawn's passives as well. The biggest downsides to this ID lie in the fact that his passive is basically dead if he's doing well, but he's a really solid ID nowadays who supports the team very well. It genuinely feels weird to be recommending him with how bad he is at Uptie 3, but he's had a major glow up in the meantime. That's it for all the members of the team that I would consider for the core, but there are 2 other IDs that are solid enough to be used in a charge team that need to be mentioned. The first is W Corp Faust, who just isn't as useful as she could be. She's tanky and focuses on inflicting a lot of debuffs for a control style, plus gives a random ally 1 charge count after every skill she uses thanks to her passive. She lacks in speed, having the second slowest speed range possible at 2 to 4, and also doesn't do too much damage despite half of her skills benefiting from load. She also can't really benefit from Telepole due to how her charge gain is very low, and doesn't feel Fluid Sac as well as Multicrack does. The other one is W Corp Hong Lu, who has the benefit of perfectly fueling his own Dimension Shredder, not that he really needs it. However, his insanely high speed at least means that the fragile it inflicts isn't going to waste. He generates a lot of charge count for himself, which gains him haste while he has it, and can spend that charge count using his skill 3 to give up to 10 charge barrier to 2 allies. While that's a lot of next turn charge, the fact that you can't do it very often really holds him back, but the ID itself is still very solid overall. Any of these IDs that are on screen right now can be used in your primarily charged team, and the team should be more than successful. Even W Corp Yi Sang and Rabbit Heathcliff can be thrown in here if you need a 6th due to the lack of other IDs. They just don't provide as much for the archetype as the rest, though Rabbit can use Telepole a lot better than Multicrack can, if that's any consolation. But that's not to say that these are the only IDs that can be used. I've been alluding to another strategy involving Charge IDs this whole time. You see, there's a select subset of non-Charge IDs who synergize really well with Charge due to their ability to contribute to Envy, Resonance, and all the E.G.O that get bonuses from it. Specifically, all the most important Charge E.G.O happen to be Envy, and the Electric Screaming and Dimension Shredders both gain additional bonuses from Resonance or Envy Resonance. Envy Resonance also has additional bonuses thanks to Multicrack Faust inflicting Envy Fragility through both her Skill 3 and her Hexnail E.G.O. The 4 IDs I'm referring to here are Pequod Heathcliff, Middle Don Quixote, Middle Merceau, and the newly released Princess of La Mancha Land Rodian. All of these IDs are built with Envy Resonance, or Resonance in mind, and Rodian at least gets bonuses from Resonance on her skills by buffing allies. Despite none of them having Charge in their kit, they can still benefit heavily from Charge thanks to their assortment of useful Charge E.G.O. Pequod Heathcliff is a really good user of Telepole since he has no reason to keep any charge count that he happens to get. Middle Don Quixote is great at getting the full bonus of Electric Screaming thanks to her access to Telepole and ease of activating Envy Resonance. Middle Merceau can take advantage of his own Electric Screaming to provide charge to more allies thanks to the high amount of Envy Resonance, though even if you don't have him, W Corp Merceau works just as well for Envy Resonance setups. And while Princess Rodian actually has nothing to synergize with charge, Hexnail is a great healing E.G.O that also deals quite a lot of damage if you would rather have an ID that's more powerful instead of one of the substituting charge IDs. These aren't even the only bonuses that come with focusing on Resonance. Merceau's Electric Screaming and Heathcliff's Binds both give quite a lot of offense and defense level when you're activating Resonance of any kind, which is going to make clashing a lot easier. Additionally, all of these IDs make bleed a lot more prominent in a charge team. This means that IDs like Red Eyes and Penitence Ryoshu and Rhino Murso become a lot more viable for a charge team, since half of their gimmick aren't going to be off on the wayside anymore. It's especially good for both because they both have Envy skill 1s, and Rhino Murso can actually use his charge for things other than Electric Screaming's Corrosion. Ryoshu even has a really good Envy E.G.O and Red Eyes open, so it's not like she's missing out on the Envy E.G.O requirement either. The majority of support passives that have to do with charge are unfortunately both not very good and are found on the IDs you would most likely want to bring in the team anyways. The only exceptions are for W Corp Honglu and W Corp Faust. Honglu gives haste to a member of your party for free, which is always a welcome bonus, and Faust allows the unit with the lowest max HP to gain an additional charge count when they gain charge count, which always targets W Corp Ryoshu if she's in the party. Now we're immediately thrust into the generic support passives that are most useful for charge teams. Yi-Sang's support passives provide two different ways of SP recovery, and while Ring Yi-Sang is not going to be owned by everybody, LCB Sinner Yi-Sang's support passive is actually really solid and everybody has it. Also speaking of SP recovery, LCB Sinner Honglu gives passive SP recovery, though Sloth is going to be fueled a bit less quickly in charge than some other affinities will. Gregor is your best choice for HP recovery support passives, with the easiest to fuel being once again his LCB Sinner ID. That said, Priest of La Mancha Land Gregor provides more healing than the other two, but he's also probably the rarest ID of the three. If you're not bringing Ishmael or Heathcliff into the fight, they both have a pretty good choice for a support passive, though the bonuses you get from each is pretty small, and realistically you could just take anything you can feel for both of them, since both of these IDs are 3 stars that are kind of hard to obtain. Rodion has 3 different support passives that amplify your damage, though 2 of them are fueled by Wrath, and if you like to use E.G.O, your Wrath stockpile is likely not going to be full at all times in a charged team. While LCCB Rodion's support passive isn't always going to be active, it's super easy to fuel in charge, and most strong enemies now frequently use their defense skills. Lastly, Sinclair has various options for support passives, giving a small damage or defense boost, or if you're using the Envy Resonance variant of the charge team, the extra final power from Blade Lineage Sinclair is also a pretty good option. The order of your team doesn't really matter too much in the classic charge setup. Since most effects that give allies charge don't care about deployment order, you'll get the same benefits regardless of the team order. The only thing to keep in mind is that if you're not sacrificing a team slot, you'll want to put your W Corp units that are actually good at damage, being Murso, Ryoshu, Don Quixote, and Otis, near the back of your deployment order so that they gain benefits from Otis's Clash power-up, but even then, it isn't too necessary and you should be successful without it. If you're sacrificing a team slot, this math changes quite a lot. Charge IDs benefit a lot from an additional slot thanks to it basically doubling their natural charge gain. Whoever gets this bonus obviously has to be deployed first in order to get the most out of it, the best candidates of which are W Ryoshu, Red Eyes and Penitence Ryoshu, W Don Quixote, W Otis, and Multicrack Faust. This is because they are all exceptional damage dealers and become way better with increased charge gain. And while this isn't something that you can take advantage of in the current railway, I still think it's good information to have. Lastly, of course, we have Charge E.G.O gifts. These can be neatly divided into 2 categories, gifts that give charge, and gifts that give effects when you have enough charge. And every one of these E.G.O gifts is good. I'm not going to talk about the ones that give charge so much because they all just contribute to the same thing, and so they're always going to be useful in a charge team regardless. Between your starting gifts, the best 2 to pick up, if you can only pick 2, are Employee Card and Patrolling Flashlight. Employee Card gives charge to everyone every turn, and Flashlight, while it doesn't give charge on turn 1, is a lot more reliable than Portable Battery Socket. Of the gifts that give bonuses for having charge, the worst one is definitely Night Vision Goggles. This is the only gift that spends charge count to activate its effect, which can occasionally reduce your charge below the threshold for DDEDR or RIP Dimension. Curriculum Vitae is, contrarily, one of the best eco gifts you can get, as it gives haste to your entire party. Gloom skills are also pretty common on Charge IDs, meaning that the power-up it also gives is going to be pretty common in a team. Wrist guards and UPS system are good for the same reason, giving damage up basically for free because the amount of charge you need for them is pretty much impossible not to have by turn 2 in a charge team thanks to all the E.G.O gifts that give you charge. Uncapped Defibrillator is basically free healing in charge, though there are enough other gifts that heal for free that it isn't usually needed. Imitative Generator is insanely good, giving free coin power to your skill 3s that consume charge count, while giving skills like DDEDR, Rip Space, and Mind Whip an extra 25% damage boost as well. While rare, it's pretty much always worth purchasing if you find it and are using a charge team. Fragment of Friction actually activates a lot, since the majority of Charge E.G.O are Envy E.G.O, but the extra power it gives isn't usually something that will matter too much in mirror dungeons. And there's also a bunch of charge gifts that are exclusive to specific floor theme packs. Starting with the Murder on the Warp Express pack, E-type Dimensional Dagger and Portable Barrier Battery both improve the abilities of skill 1s that involve charge count, with the Dagger boosting damage and clash power, and the Battery boosting the amount of charge gained. They also have bonus effects specifically for W-Corp IDs. Biogenerative Battery gives a bunch of offense level for free to IDs that have charge count, while also giving haste and offense level up if the turn ends with enough charge count. It's not a bad gift in any sense of the word. Cardiovascular Reactive Module isn't nearly as good, granting shield if you lose a clash while you have charge count. Prosthetic Joint Servos gives free haste and charge count for any ID who can gain charge count on their skills, and also gives bonus charge count to multi-crack office IDs whenever they gain some. And lastly, exclusive to the Noon of Violet floor pack, Misaligned Transistor causes your charge spending skills to spend 50% more charge count, but also gives them a significant damage bonus whenever you spend charge count on a skill. Notably, this makes DDEDR and Rip Dimension cost more charge count than you can have without E.G.O gifts or the passives of Multicrack Heathcliff or Otis's Dimension Shredder. There are 5 fusion gifts for the charge archetype, so we'll start with the most important and most universally attainable one in T1 Perpetual Motion Machine. Every charge ID gains 7 charge barrier at the turn start, and gains a significant amount of damage up based on how much charge count they have. It's basically a stronger version of wrist guards, which makes sense because you make it by combining wrist guards with material interference force field. It's pretty much always worth getting if you're doing a charge run. Automated Joints is gotten by combining prosthetic joint servos and biogenerative battery. It makes all skills that consume charge count gain coin power and up to 40% more damage, gives haste and damage up for each time an ID consumes charge each turn, and gives multi-crack office IDs more free coin power when they have 5 or more charge. This is frankly an insane gift, and if it wasn't locked to a specific floor pack, I'd recommend getting it every run. Overcharged Battery is made using Biogenerative Battery and Crystallized Blood, a gift that has nothing to do with charge. It gives the same coin power and damage as the first effect of Automated Joints, but also gives free charge count on winning a clash as well as 2 free clash power. It also makes Envy skills inflict Envy fragility on winning a clash, which is pretty nice. Overall though, it's a bit weaker than Automated Joints, and since you can only get 1 Biogenerative Battery per run, it's probably better to prioritize using it for that gift instead. Perpetual Generator Servos is made using Prosthetic Joint Servos and Cardiovascular Reactive Module. It has the same coin power and damage bonuses as the other two, but gives 1 clash power to allies with charge count, plus 2 offense level up for the next turn every time they win a clash. When an ally dies, they also heal and consume all of their charge count and gain 3 protection for the rest of the fight as well. It's probably the weakest of the combined charged E.G.O gifts in terms of overall effectiveness. Lastly, we have Heart's Power Jewel, made using Cardiovascular Reactive Module and Crystallized Blood. Same first effect as the last 3, plus it increases your max charge count by 5. After using a skill 3 that consumes charge count, you will then also consume the rest of your charge count in order to deal bonus fixed damage by how much you consume, up to 75% of the damage you dealt with that skill. This can add up to a lot of extra damage, so it's a pretty helpful gift, and since you're already using your Biogenerative Battery on Automated Joints, you can afford to use your Crystallized Blood for this instead. Now that's all the charge gifts, but which ones are the best to be upgraded? In terms of gifts that give you more charge, it's worth upgrading Lightning Rod and Charge-type gloves so that you gain more charge count every turn. Patrolling Flashlight is also good as it gives you another ally to gain charge barrier from it, leading to more charge count. The rest aren't really needed to be upgraded since they don't provide too much more, but if you haven't happened to find any of the above, you could do so in order to improve your charge gain instead. The best gifts to upgrade that provide bonuses for having charge are UPS System, Wrist Guards, and Curriculum Vitae. While Wrist Guards is a fusion material, gaining even more damage up in the meantime is very helpful. Curriculum Vitae's buffs are also just really nice to have more of, and UPS System giving both charge and some damage up meaning it performs double duty if you intend to upgrade it. And that's about all there is to say about the Charge archetype as a whole, and boy, was there a lot to say. I hope you found this overview helpful, and would appreciate if you liked the video and subscribed, because this one was a lot of work to put together. If you want to try out a Charge team but are missing one key piece of the puzzle, I have all 8 of the Charge 3-star IDs maxed out with their most important E.G.O equipped in my company, so feel free to add me in-game if you'd like to try them out for yourself. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you all again soon.